My name is Navroz Dubash, and I'm a senior fellow at an institute called the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. And I do work on environmental issues, environmental regulation, and global governance related to environment, energy, environmental politics, and so on. I am a lead author in Chapter 4, which is the chapter on no growth, new growth or no growth, essentially around environmental issues, growth, the nature and quality of growth. In terms of contribution to the panel, what I'm hoping is that collectively the panel will lay out a reasonable sketch of a progressive vision of the future. Something that doesn't necessarily provide narrow policy answers, but that provokes interesting discussion by asking hard questions, by providing alternative visions of the future, and seeing if we can get a discussion going around long-term change based on all of that. And then for me personally, I'm just hoping to have some interesting conversations. I should say that I've come out of the Intergovernmental Panel on climate change process, so I have a little bit of a sense of processes like these, but I think this is quite a different process from that. Then we're doing some work these days looking at how decision-making can explicitly incorporate multiple objectives of development policy. By that I mean, typically a development policy is thought of through a cost-benefit analysis lens. It's looked at in terms of technical feasibilities, and we think those things are important, but there are often other objectives that get left out because they're hard to quantify, such as distributional implications, social implications such as whether it's lifestyles of families, whether it's gender dynamics within the household. It might be implementation considerations, so transaction costs that make a policy hard to implement. We're trying to develop a methodology where you can examine ex ante policy decisions through this multiple objectives lens, and that way force decision makers in a sense and give them a tool to consider these different objectives of policy rather than just thinking about the economic objectives and everything else as an externality. If you look at the energy arena, which is one area I'm engaged in, one of the challenges is dealing with the simultaneous steep increases in energy demands in certain parts, rapidly growing parts of the world, at the same time as you have essentially planetary boundaries or planetary constraints in the form of climate change, in the form of, if not planetary, then local boundaries in the form of air pollution. How do you square that circle? How do you assure sufficient energy and access to energy to meet basic needs and to provide livelihoods at the same time as you stay within planetary and local environmental boundaries? So I think we're in this interesting, the next 10 to 15 years is really going to be critical for this. Because I think after about 20 years, we can see a renewable energy future developing that's much cleaner, but in the interim, our energy needs are going to be enormous, and we don't have the technologies mature enough, nor the institutional structures ready to actually scale those things up fast enough. So we've got a 10 or 15 year bridge period, but that 10 or 15 years is critical from the point of view of local health, climate change, and so on. So that to me is a big challenge that we have to face. It's also a bigger challenge because it involves inter-country distribution issues. So one way of thinking about this is if the richest countries actually left some development space, created some development space for the countries that are growing rapidly, then that might be one possible solution to the problem. On the other hand, the richer countries would argue that then places them at a competitive disadvantage vis-a-vis the poorer countries. And it's that competitive dynamic that has really hindered climate change negotiations in particular. And the question then is, how do you turn that to a more cooperative dynamic? So that's another way of framing a similar challenge. Part of it is technology, but I tend not to put that much faith in technology-led solutions alone. It's got to be technology plus institutional plus social and normative change altogether. So in the problem that I just laid out, I think it would have to be a combination of real structural changes in how we develop. So we build cities differently, we build mobility systems differently, we build housing differently. One number that gets thrown out all the time in my country, which is India, is that 70% of the buildings that we are likely to see in 2030 have yet to be built. So you have a huge chance to build that infrastructure differently, similarly for roads and transportation networks and so on. So finding that different path and getting onto it soon could make a lot of those political tensions that I described earlier easier to manage. At the same time, I think there are some short-term immediate things that we need to do in other arenas. We sort of put that out there. I've talked about climate change, energy, but from a pure welfare point of view, in much of the world, what seems like a basic problem, but it's actually quite hard to solve, which is basically ending open defecation, building better sanitation systems and getting them used. That could be just a massive contributor to welfare. So it's not just about energy and climate change, there's a whole range of things out there. So I just want to make sure that we talked about the broader spectrum of things. And I think some of those social issues are also incredibly urgent and shouldn't get pushed aside in thinking about problems that are longer term and not immediate upon us. I think there's a real temptation to talk in broad brush generalizations, and that's something, if not to be avoided, then at least to be cautious about. One of the arguments that I've been making here is that we can talk about transitions in the abstract, but you start dealing with countries and political systems that are starting at a very different point. So what does transition mean in India, where these energy questions are big? One of my colleagues in my chapter is from Colombia, and for her, a lot of these environmental issues are completely secondary to basic political stability and law and order problems. That's got to be the number one agenda there. So I think finding a way to come back to points of reference in particular places at particular times is really important, because this whole effort, if it stays abstract, will be very hard for people to relate to. It's got to actually speak to people's lived experiences and their understanding of those experiences. So I think having lots of narratives drawing on those examples and using those examples to tell the bigger stories is going to be very important.